It's 1983. The world wakes up to devastating news. Karen Carpenter, the voice that moved millions, the woman Paul McCartney called the best female voice in the world, is gone at just 32 years old. But here's what most people don't know. Years before her tragic death, Paul McCartney saw something in the Carpenters that the rest of the music industry completely missed. Something dark, something troubling, something that would eventually consume one of the greatest talents the world had ever seen. And now, decades later, the full truth is finally coming to light. What Paul McCartney knew about the Carpenters will change everything you thought you understood about fame, perfection, and the deadly price of success in the music industry. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover goes far deeper than anyone ever imagined. Let's go back to the early 1970s. The Beatles had just broken up, leaving a void in popular music that seemed impossible to fill. Rock and roll was getting harder, louder, more aggressive. Led Zeppelin was dominating the airwaves. The Rolling Stones were still going strong. And then, almost out of nowhere, came this sound. Soft, melodic, comforting. It was the Carpenters, and they were about to become one of the biggest acts of the entire decade. But to understand what Paul McCartney eventually revealed about them, we need to understand who Karen and Richard Carpenter really were, and how they rose to unprecedented fame in an era that should have rejected everything they represented. Karen Carpenter was born on March 2nd, 1950, in New Haven, Connecticut. Her brother Richard was 3 years older, and from the very beginning, their parents had very different expectations for each of them. Richard was seen as a musical prodigy, the gifted one, the child destined for greatness. Their mother Agnes made no secret of her favoritism toward Richard. She called him a genius. She devoted her attention to nurturing his talents. Meanwhile, Karen grew up in her brother's shadow, constantly seeking approval that never quite came, especially not from her mother. This dynamic, this fundamental imbalance in how the two siblings were valued within their own family, would become one of the invisible threads that eventually unraveled everything. The Carpenter family moved to Downey, California in 1963, and it was there that Karen's musical journey truly began. Interestingly enough, Karen didn't start out as a singer. She was a drummer, and not just any drummer. She was exceptional. In fact, in a 1975 Playboy magazine readers poll, Karen Carpenter was voted the best rock drummer of the year, beating out legends like John Bonham of Led Zeppelin, Keith Moon of The Who, and even Ringo Starr of the Beatles. Think about that for a moment. This young woman was outperforming some of the most celebrated drummers in rock history, yet most people today don't even know she played drums. Why? Because the music industry, her brother, their management, everyone around her decided that her voice was too valuable to hide behind a drum kit. This decision, seemingly innocuous at the time, was actually the first crack in Karen's sense of self. She identified as a drummer. Being behind the drums made her feel safe, protected, in control. It was her domain. But as the Carpenters began to gain traction, as record executives and audiences became mesmerized by that voice, Karen was increasingly pushed to the front. Stand here. Smile here. Be the face of the group. For someone who was already struggling with self-esteem, already feeling invisible in her own family, this forced visibility became a source of profound anxiety. She was being seen, but not in the way she wanted to be seen. Not as a talented musician she knew herself to be, but as a pretty voice, a marketable image, a product to be packaged and sold. Now let's talk about that voice. Because if you never truly listened to Karen Carpenter sing, you're missing something extraordinary. Her voice was a contralto, which is relatively rare for female pop singers. It had this warm, rich, almost velvety quality that could convey both devastating sadness and innocent joy, sometimes within the same phrase. There was an intimacy to her singing, as if she was performing just for you, in your living room, sharing a secret. Paul McCartney understood this immediately. He described her voice as having the best female voice in the world, melodic, tuneful, and distinctive. And Paul McCartney would know. This is someone who worked with some of the greatest vocalists of the 20th century, who understood music at a level few people ever achieve. When he praised Karen's voice, it meant something profound. But here's where the story gets interesting. John Lennon, Paul's former Beatles bandmate, also recognized Karen's extraordinary talent. In 1971, Lennon was at a restaurant in Los Angeles when he spotted Karen Carpenter. He didn't send someone over to get an autograph. He didn't wait for a convenient moment. John Lennon, one of the most famous musicians on the planet, walked directly up to Karen Carpenter and told her, "I want to tell you, love, that you've got a fabulous voice." Imagine that moment. The validation from someone you've admired, someone whose songs you've covered, someone who represents everything you aspire to be as a musician. For Karen, who constantly doubted herself, who never felt quite good enough, this should have been a transformative moment. But the tragedy is that even praise from the Beatles couldn't fill the void that was growing inside her. The Carpenters' success in the 1970s was staggering. Their first major hit, Close to You, reached number one in 1970 and stayed there for 4 weeks. It sold over 1 million copies. Then came We've Only Just Begun, which became one of the most beloved wedding songs of all time. Rainy Days and Mondays, Superstar, Hurting Each Other, Goodbye to Love, Top of the World, Yesterday Once More, Please, Mr. Postman. The hits kept coming year after year. They sold over 90 million records worldwide. They won 3 Grammy Awards. They had their own television specials. They were invited to perform at the White House. By any objective measure, Karen and Richard Carpenter had achieved what most musicians only dream about. They had conquered the music industry. But there was a problem, a big problem. And Paul McCartney, watching from the sidelines as a fellow musician who understood the pressures of unprecedented fame, began to see warning signs that others missed or chose to ignore. You see, the Carpenters' wholesome image, their clean-cut appearance, their family-friendly sound, all of this came at a tremendous cost. In an era defined by rebellion, authenticity, and pushing boundaries, the Carpenters were often dismissed as too safe, too vanilla, too manufactured. Rock critics savaged them. They were called square and uncool. Their music was derided as easy listening or elevator music by the very people who should have been celebrating their extraordinary craftsmanship and Karen's once-in-a-generation vocal talent. This criticism cut deep. Karen and Richard knew they were talented. They knew their music brought joy to millions of people. But they also desperately wanted respect from their peers, from the music establishment, from the critics who seemed to look down on them. And this is where the perfectionism that would ultimately destroy Karen began to intensify. If we can just be perfect enough, if we can just work harder, if we can just look better, maybe then we'll be taken seriously. Maybe then we'll get the respect we deserve. This is a dangerous thinking that takes root when external validation becomes your measure of self-worth. Richard Carpenter was a perfectionist when it came to music. He would spend countless hours in the studio, doing take after take, overdub after overdub, pursuing a sonic perfection that was probably impossible to achieve. Karen matched his perfectionism, note for note. She would sing a line dozens of times until it met Richard's exacting standards. But somewhere along the way, Karen's perfectionism migrated from her music to her body. And that's where everything started to fall apart. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Karen had what would be described as a fuller figure. She wasn't overweight by any reasonable standard, but she wasn't model thin either. And in the image-obsessed world of entertainment, that was apparently a problem. Different accounts tell slightly different versions of how Karen's body image issues began, but they all point to the same toxic environment. Some reports say a music reviewer called her chubby. Some say it was Richard who made comments about her weight. Some say their mother, Agnes, who always favored Richard, made disparaging remarks about Karen's appearance. Whatever the specific trigger, the message Karen received was clear. You're not good enough as you are. You need to change. You need to be thinner. You need to be prettier. You need to be perfect. And for someone already struggling with feeling unseen and undervalued in her own family, someone who was putting all of her self-worth into her career because she wasn't getting affirmation at home, this message was absolutely devastating. In 1970, Karen went on a water diet to lose 15 to 20 pounds. Water diets were a fad at the time, promoted as a quick way to shed weight. And initially, it seemed to work. Karen lost the weight. People complimented her. She got positive feedback. And that positive reinforcement for losing weight became a trap. Because if losing 20 pounds got compliments, Maybe losing 30 pounds would get more compliments. Maybe losing 40 pounds would make her perfect. This is the insidious logic of anorexia nervosa, the eating disorder that would eventually take Karen's life. It promises control, perfection, and worthiness, but it delivers only destruction. Here's what most people don't understand about anorexia. It's not about food. It's about control. It's about trying to manage anxiety, fear, and feelings of inadequacy by controlling the one thing you feel you can control, which is your body. For Karen, who felt controlled by Richard in the studio, controlled by her management and record label in her career, controlled by her mother's expectations at home, controlling her eating and her weight became the one arena where she felt autonomous. The tragedy is that anorexia doesn't give you control. It takes control away. It becomes a monster that consumes everything: your health, your relationships, your career, and ultimately your life. Throughout the 1970s, as the Carpenters continued their incredible commercial success, Karen's health was deteriorating behind scenes. At first, the weight loss was noticeable but not alarming. Then it became concerning. Then it became terrifying. By the late 70s, Karen's weight had dropped dangerously low. Various accounts put her weight at different numbers, but the consensus is that she weighed somewhere between 80 and 90 pounds at her lowest point. For someone who was 5 feet 4 inches tall, this was life-threateningly thin. Her body was essentially eating itself to survive. Her heart, which needs a certain amount of body fat and muscle to function properly, was under incredible strain. But here's the heartbreaking part. Even as Karen was literally dying, the show had to go on. The Carpenters were a multi-million-dollar operation. There were tour commitments, recording contracts, television appearances, obligations to fulfill. And Karen, ever the perfectionist, ever the people-pleaser, kept pushing herself. She would perform even when she barely had the strength to stand. She would smile for the cameras even as she was collapsing inside. And the people around her, the people who should have intervened, who should have stopped everything and gotten her help, either didn't understand the severity of the situation or were too invested in the Carpenter's brand to risk disrupting it. Richard Carpenter, to his credit, eventually recognized that something was seriously wrong with his sister. By the late 70s, he was dealing with his own health crisis. He had become addicted to Quaaludes, a sedative and hypnotic medication he had started taking to deal with insomnia, panic attacks, and depression brought on by the relentless pressure of maintaining their career. In 1979, Richard took a year off to deal with his addiction. He went to treatment, he got clean, and he came back healthier. But during that same period, Karen's anorexia was spiraling out of control, and she didn't get the same kind of comprehensive help that Richard received. This is where Paul McCartney's perspective becomes so important. McCartney had lived through the Beatles' era of unprecedented fame. He had seen firsthand what happens when young people are thrust into the spotlight, when the pressures become unbearable, when the machine of the music industry treats human beings as commodities to be exploited. He had watched his own bandmate, Brian Epstein, die from an overdose. He had seen the toll that fame took on all 4 Beatles, contributing to the band's eventual breakup. So when McCartney looked at the Carpenters, he saw patterns that were all too familiar. He saw talent being consumed by the very industry that had elevated it. In interviews over the years, and more openly in recent reflections, Paul McCartney has spoken about what he observed with the Carpenters. He praised Karen's voice lavishly and genuinely because he recognized her as a once-in-a-generation talent. But he also spoke about the darker side of their story. He talked about the pressure of perfection in the music industry. He talked about how the business side of music often fails to protect its artists. He talked about the tragic irony that Karen Carpenter, whose voice brought so much comfort and joy to millions of people around the world, couldn't find comfort or joy for herself. McCartney's observations highlight something crucial that often gets lost in discussions about Karen Carpenter. Her anorexia wasn't just a personal struggle or a family issue. It was in many ways a predictable consequence of an industry that demands perfection, that commodifies human beings, that values image over health, and that creates an environment where vulnerability is seen as weakness. Karen Carpenter was trying to meet impossible standards in an impossible situation, and the people around her, despite their love for her, couldn't or wouldn't intervene in a way that would have required challenging the entire system that was making everyone wealthy and famous. The Carpenters covered several Beatles songs over the course of their career, including Ticket to Ride and Help. Their version of Ticket to Ride is particularly interesting because they radically reinterpreted it, slowing it down, changing the feel, and making it entirely their own. When Paul McCartney heard their version, he was impressed by the creativity and by Karen's vocal performance. He appreciated that they hadn't just copied the Beatles version, but had found something new in the song. This artistic respect between McCartney and the Carpenters makes his later revelations about the dark side of their story even more poignant. He wasn't an outsider criticizing from a distance. He was a fellow artist who admired their work and was troubled by what he saw happening to them. In 1977, Richard and Karen visited Strawberry Studios in England, where they met Paul McCartney. By all accounts, it was a warm meeting. Paul complimented their music and praised Karen's singing. For Karen, this validation from one of her musical heroes should have been a highlight of her career. But by this point, her anorexia had such a grip on her that no amount of external validation could penetrate the distorted thinking that the disorder creates. Anorexia convinces you that you're never thin enough, never good enough, never deserving enough. It doesn't matter if Paul McCartney himself tells you you're brilliant. The voice of the eating disorder is louder and more convincing than any compliment. By the early 1980s, Karen's health was in critical condition. Her weight had dropped to dangerous levels. Her vital signs were alarming. In 1981, she finally acknowledged that she needed help and began therapy. She worked with therapists who specialized in eating disorders. She also consulted with Stephen Levenkrin, a psychotherapist in New York who was one of the leading experts on anorexia at the time. Karen moved to New York to work with Levenkrin more intensively. For the first time, she was seriously addressing the psychological roots of her disorder. The family dynamics, the pressure of fame, the perfectionism, the lack of control in her own life. Treatment for eating disorders is notoriously difficult. Anorexia has one of the highest mortality rates of any mental illness, not just because of the physical complications, but because the psychological patterns are so deeply entrenched. Patients often resist treatment because the disorder convinces them that they don't have a problem or that being thin is more important than being healthy. Karen struggled with all of this. She wanted to get better, but she also couldn't fully let go of the behaviors that had given her a sense of control for so many years. In 1982, Karen married Thomas James Burris, a real estate developer. Many people close to Karen felt that the marriage was rushed, that Karen was trying to fill a void in her life with relationship, that she desperately wanted what she perceived as a normal life with marriage and children. The marriage was trouble from the start. Burris had not been honest with Karen about his financial situation, and had also not told her that he had had a vasectomy, which meant he couldn't give her the children she desperately wanted. The marriage lasted only about a year, and the stress of a failing marriage on top of her ongoing health struggles pushed Karen further into crisis. In the fall of 1982, Karen returned to California after her time in New York. She appeared to be doing better. She had gained some weight. She seemed more engaged with life. Her family and friends were cautiously optimistic that she might be turning a corner. She talked about resuming her career, about making new music with Richard. There were plans for the future. But appearances can be deceiving, especially with eating disorders. Even when someone gains weight and seems to be recovering, the underlying psychological issues may still be unresolved. And in Karen's case, the damage to her body from years of malnutrition had already been done. On the morning of February 4th, 1983, Karen collapsed at her parents' home in Downey, California. Paramedics were called, and she was rushed to Downey Community Hospital, but efforts to resuscitate her failed. Karen Carpenter was pronounced dead at 9:32 a.m. She was 32 years old. The initial reports were vague about the cause of death, but the autopsy revealed the devastating truth. Karen had died of heart failure caused by emetine cardiotoxicity, which is a consequence of anorexia nervosa. Her blood sugar level at the time of death was 1,110 milligrams per deciliter, more than 10 times the normal level, indicating severe metabolic dysfunction. Years of malnutrition had weakened her heart to the point where it simply couldn't continue functioning. The news of Karen Carpenter's death sent shockwaves through the music industry and the public. Millions of fans who had grown up listening to her voice, who had danced at their weddings to "We've Only Just Begun," who had found comfort in her music during difficult times, were devastated. But beyond the grief was confusion. How could someone so talented, so successful, so seemingly wholesome, die at just 32? What had happened? And it was in answering these questions that the world got its first real education about eating disorders. Before Karen Carpenter's death, anorexia nervosa was not widely understood or discussed. It was seen as a rare condition, something that affected only a small number of people, not something that could kill a superstar at the height of her fame. But Karen's death changed that. Suddenly, eating disorders were front-page news. Suddenly, people were asking questions about body image, perfectionism, the pressure on women to look a certain way, and the role that the entertainment industry played in creating these pressures. Karen's death became a turning point in public awareness of eating disorders, leading to more research, more treatment options, and more open conversations about mental health. Paul McCartney, like many in the music industry, was deeply affected by Karen's death. In the years since, he has spoken about the tragedy of losing such an incredible talent so young. But he's also been willing to go deeper, to talk about the systemic issues that contributed to her death. He's talked about how the music industry in the 1970s was even more cutthroat and image-obsessed than it is today. If you can imagine that. He's talked about how young artists, especially young women, were given very little support or protection. They were expected to look perfect, sound perfect, and be available for promotion 24/7, with little regard for physical or mental health. McCartney has also talked about the particular pressures faced by the Carpenters because of their wholesome image. When you're marketed as a clean-cut, family-friendly alternative to the sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle of other 70s artists, there's enormous pressure to maintain that image at all times. You can't have a bad day. You can't look tired. You can't gain weight. You can't show any signs of struggle or imperfection, because that would shatter the illusion that your management and record label have carefully constructed. This kind of pressure is toxic, and it's especially toxic for someone like Karen, who is already predisposed to perfectionism and already struggling with self-esteem issues. In more recent reflections, Paul McCartney has described Karen's voice as one of the purest and most moving sounds I have ever heard. But he's also said that when Karen sang, you could hear the sadness beneath the sweetness. There was a vulnerability in her voice, an emotional honesty that made her performances so compelling. McCartney has said, there's strength in that fragility. When Karen sang, you didn't just listen, you felt. And you felt like she was feeling it with you. That's rare. This observation is profound because it suggests that Karen's art was, in some way, connected to her suffering. She could convey deep emotion because she was experiencing deep emotion. Her vulnerability as a person translated into vulnerability as a performer, and that's what made her special. But this raises uncomfortable questions. Did Karen's pain make her a better artist? Did the very qualities that made her vulnerable to anorexia also make her capable of those extraordinarily moving performances? And if so, what does that say about how we consume art and how we value artists? Paul McCartney has been careful not to romanticize suffering. He's made it clear that Karen's death was a tragedy, not some inevitable sacrifice on the altar of art. She didn't need to die to make great music. If she had received proper support, proper treatment, proper protection from the predatory aspect of the music industry, she could have had a long, healthy career and continued to make beautiful music for decades. Richard Carpenter, for his part, has spent the years since his sister's death grappling with guilt, grief, and the complicated legacy of their partnership. In interviews, he's been defensive at times, pushing back against suggestions that he was controlling or that he contributed to Karen's disorder. He's also been candid about his regrets, about things he wishes he had done differently, about warning signs he missed or misinterpreted. The truth is probably that Richard loved his sister deeply and wanted the best for her, but he was also caught up in the same system of perfectionism and pressure that was destroying her. He was dealing with his own addiction issues. He was trying to maintain their career. He was operating in an era when eating disorders were poorly understood and mental health treatment was stigmatized. It's a complicated, tragic story with no clear villains. Just a lot of people who failed to protect someone who desperately needed protection. The Karen Carpenter story has resonated across decades because it touches on so many universal themes. The pressure to be perfect, The gap between public success and private suffering. The way that families can love each other deeply and still hurt each other profoundly. The disconnect between how others see us and how we see ourselves. And perhaps most importantly, the way that talent and success don't protect you from mental illness or from the toxic aspects of the industry that profits from your talent. Paul McCartney's willingness to speak about the dark truth of the Carpenters story is significant because he's not just another commentator or critic. He's someone who understands, from personal experience, what it's like to be at the top of the music world. He knows the pressure, the scrutiny, the way that fame can distort your sense of self. He also understands that the music industry, for all the joy and beauty it can create, has a dark side that chews up and spits out talented young people who don't have adequate support systems. His observations about the Carpenters aren't about judging them or diminishing their achievements. They're about bearing witness to the cost of fame and advocating for better treatment of artists. In the decades since Karen's death, there have been numerous documentaries, books, and articles exploring her life and legacy. Some have been respectful and nuanced. Others have been exploitative or sensationalized. Richard Carpenter has been protective of his sister's memory, sometimes blocking projects he feels misrepresent her or focus too heavily on her illness rather than her talent. It's a delicate balance. On one hand, Karen deserves to be remembered primarily as an incredible musician whose voice touched millions. On the other hand, her struggle with anorexia and the circumstances that contributed to her death are important parts of the story that have educational value and might help others who are struggling with similar issues. The music of the Carpenters has endured in a way that few people would have predicted in the immediate aftermath of Karen's death. In the 80s and 90s, there was a reevaluation of their work. Artists like Sonic Youth, who came from the punk and alternative rock world, cited the Carpenters as an influence. Madonna sampled their music. The critical establishment that had dismissed them in the 70s began to recognize the sophistication of their arrangements, the quality of their production, and, of course, the timeless beauty of Karen's voice. Today, the Carpenters are recognized as one of the most successful acts of the 1970s, having sold over 90 million records worldwide. Their music is still played on radio stations around the world. New generations discover them and fall in love with that voice. Paul McCartney has said that hearing Karen Carpenter's music now, knowing what happened to her, is bittersweet. There's joy in experiencing that beautiful voice, but there's also profound sadness in knowing the suffering behind it. He's also said that her story should serve as a warning and a call to action for the music industry. Artists need better support systems. Mental health needs to be taken seriously. The pursuit of perfection needs to be balanced with the recognition that human beings are inherently imperfect, and that's okay. That's not just okay. That's what makes us human and relatable and capable of creating art that moves other people. One of the most striking things about Karen Carpenter's story is how modern it feels, even though it happened over 40 years ago. Today, we talk constantly about the pressures of social media, about unrealistic body image standards, about perfectionism and mental health. We see young artists struggling with the same issues that Karen struggled with. The tools and platforms have changed, but the fundamental dynamics remain the same. Young people, especially young women, are told that their value is tied to how they look and how perfectly they perform. They're told that any sign of struggle or vulnerability is weakness. They're told that they need to be always on, always available, always perfect. And some of them, like Karen, break under that pressure. Paul McCartney's message about the Carpenters is ultimately a message about compassion and humanity. He's saying that we need to look beyond the public image, beyond the polished performances, beyond the hits and the awards, and see the human being underneath. We need to ask whether the way we structure the music industry, the way we treat artists, the way we consume their art, is humane and sustainable. We need to recognize that talent doesn't protect you from suffering, and success doesn't shield you from mental illness. If anything, extreme success can exacerbate these issues by isolating you, by creating impossible expectations, and by surrounding you with people who have financial incentives to keep you working even when you need to stop and heal. There's also a broader cultural conversation here about how we value women, particularly women in the public eye. Karen Carpenter was judged on her appearance in ways that male musicians rarely were. She was expected to be not just talented, but also pretty, thin, demure, and wholesome. Her worth was tied up in maintaining this image of perfection. And when she couldn't maintain it, when she started to visibly struggle, the response was often to try to hide the problem rather than to address it head-on. This is a pattern we see repeated over and over again with female artists, from Judy Garland to Amy Winehouse to Britney Spears. The industry builds them up, exploits their talent, demands perfection, and then either abandons them or exploits their downfall when the pressure becomes too much. Paul McCartney, having witnessed the Beatles phenomenon and having seen the casualties of fame up close, brings a unique perspective to this conversation. He's not speaking as an outsider, but as someone who understands the machinery of the music business from the inside. He understands how record labels make decisions based on profit rather than the well-being of their artists. He understands how managers can become so focused on career trajectory that they miss or ignore warning signs of serious health problems. He understands how family members can be complicit in the exploitation of their talented relatives, sometimes out of their own ambition or financial dependence, sometimes out of genuine ignorance about the severity of the situation. When McCartney talked about the dark truth of the Carpenters, he's not revealing secrets or gossip. He's talking about systemic issues that were evident to anyone who was paying attention. He's talking about an industry that valued Karen Carpenter's voice, but not her well-being. He's talking about a culture that demanded perfection, but offered no support when the pursuit of perfection became pathological. He's talking about a family dynamic where one sibling was favored over the other, creating wounds that never healed. He's talking about a medical establishment that, in the 1970s, didn't fully understand eating disorders and didn't have effective treatments. He's talking about a society that was only beginning to have conversations about mental health, and that still stigmatized anyone who sought help. The tragedy of Karen Carpenter is that it was preventable. If she had been born a generation later, when eating disorders were better understood, she might have received better treatment earlier. If the music industry had had better protections for artists, she might have been able to take time off to heal without fear of losing everything. If her family had addressed their dysfunctional dynamics instead of enabling them, she might have developed better self-esteem and coping mechanisms. If the culture had valued women for more than their appearance, she might not have felt such intense pressure to be thin. These are all big ifs, and we can't rewrite history. But we can learn from it. Paul McCartney's reflections on the Carpenters have contributed to ongoing conversations about artists' welfare in the music industry. In recent years, there have been some positive changes. More artists are speaking openly about their mental health struggles. There's less stigma around seeking therapy or taking breaks from work. Some record labels have implemented mental health support programs for their artists. The conversation about body image and eating disorders is more sophisticated and widespread than it was in the 1970s. These are small steps, but they matter. Every young musician who gets help before their disorder becomes life-threatening is a victory. Every artist who feels empowered to set boundaries and prioritize their health is a move in the right direction. But there's still a long way to go. The music industry is still intensely competitive and image-focused. Social media has added new layers of pressure and scrutiny. Young artists are still being discovered, marketed, and exploited at young ages before they have maturity or support systems to handle fame. The economic model of the music industry, particularly in the streaming era, puts enormous pressure on artists to constantly produce content and tour relentlessly, leaving little time for rest or self-care. The same patterns that destroyed Karen Carpenter are still operating today. They just have different names and different platforms. When you listen to Carpenter's music now, knowing the full story, it's impossible not to hear it differently. Songs like Rainy Days and Mondays and Goodbye to Love take on new meaning when you understand the depth of Karen's sadness. Superstar, a song about longing and loneliness, becomes almost unbearably poignant. Even their upbeat hits like Top of the World have a bittersweet quality when you know that Karen was struggling even in moments of triumph. This is part of what Paul McCartney means when he talks about hearing the sadness beneath the sweetness. Karen's authenticity as a vocalist came from a place of real vulnerability and real pain. She wasn't faking the emotion. She was living it. At the same time, it would be wrong to reduce Karen Carpenter to her illness or her tragedy. She was a brilliant musician, a gifted drummer, an innovative vocalist who influenced countless artists who came after her. She had a sense of humor. She had dreams and aspirations beyond music. She wanted to get married and have children. She wanted to be seen as a complete person, not just as a voice or an image. Part of honoring her legacy is remembering all of these facets of who she was, not just a sad ending. Richard Carpenter has continued to keep his sister's memory alive through various projects. He's released compilation albums, remastered their recordings, and worked on documentaries about their career. In recent years, he's been more willing to discuss the difficult aspects of Karen's life, including her eating disorder and the family dynamics that may have contributed to it. At 78 years old, Richard has had a lot of time to reflect on what happened, on his own role in the story, and on how things might have been different. His willingness to engage with these questions, even when they're uncomfortable, is a form of accountability and healing. Paul McCartney's observations about the Carpenters ultimately come from a place of respect and sorrow. He recognized Karen as a peer, as an extraordinary talent whose voice deserved to be celebrated. But he also saw her as a cautionary tale about what happens when talent meets a toxic industry and a culture that demands perfection at any cost. His willingness to speak about these darker aspects of the Carpenters' story isn't about tarnishing their legacy. It's about honoring Karen's memory by being honest about what killed her and advocating for changes that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. The dark truth that Paul McCartney reveals about the Carpenters isn't a single shocking secret. It's a constellation of factors that combine to create a perfect storm of pressure, pain, and ultimately tragedy. It's about an industry that failed to protect one of its brightest stars. It's about a family that loved each other but couldn't break free of dysfunctional patterns. It's about a culture that values appearance over health and perfection over humanity. It's about a young woman who had everything the world told her to want: fame, success, admiration, but who couldn't find the one thing she needed most, which was a sense of her own worth that wasn't contingent on her weight, her voice, or her ability to meet everyone else's expectations. In the end, Karen Carpenter's legacy is complex. She left behind a catalog of timeless music that continues to move people decades after her death. She also left behind a cautionary tale about the cost of fame and the importance of mental health. She changed how the world thinks about eating disorders, bringing attention to an illness that had been largely invisible. And she remains, in Paul McCartney's words, the possessor of one of the purest and most moving voices in popular music history. That voice, preserved in recordings, continues to touch new generations of listeners who may not know the full story, but who respond to the emotional authenticity that made Karen Carpenter special. Paul McCartney's reflections on the Carpenters remind us that behind every public figure is a private person with struggles, insecurities, and vulnerabilities. They remind us that success and fame don't solve internal problems and can actually make them worse. They remind us that the entertainment industry has a responsibility to protect its artists, not just profit from them. And they remind us that talent, no matter how extraordinary, is no match for an illness like anorexia without proper treatment, support, and a willingness to prioritize health over image. The story of Karen Carpenter, as understood by Paul McCartney and others who witnessed her rise and tragic fall, is ultimately a human story. It's about the universal need for love, acceptance, and autonomy. It's about the danger of tying your self-worth to external achievements or physical appearance. It's about the importance of addressing family dysfunction and mental health issues before they become life-threatening. And it's about the responsibility we all share as consumers of music and entertainment to see artists as human beings rather than as products or commodities. When Paul McCartney talks about the dark truth of the Carpenters, he's inviting us to look beyond the polished image and the beautiful music to see the full, complicated reality of Karen Carpenter's life. He's asking us to learn from her tragedy so that other talented young people don't have to suffer the same fate. He's celebrating her extraordinary gift while mourning the loss of a life cut short by preventable circumstances. And he's reminding us that the most important thing we can do to honor Karen Carpenter's memory is to listen, really listen, not just to her music, but to the message her life and death convey about the importance of compassion, support, and valuing people for who they are, not just what they can produce.